What's poppin', mi gente? It's your boy back with another video. Now first let me apologize that for the last 2 weeks there's been no update, but I've been dealing with being sick followed by dealing with a very busy schedule consisting of work and real life stuff. So I wanted to make sure I drop an update this week though, so you guys didn't think I'd fallen off the planet. So I appreciate all my loyal Patreon supporters. I appreciate all my fans for being patient with me here. Let's go ahead and talk about Sprite Sheets. Now, Sprite Sheets, for anybody who's been checking out my Patreon page, you'll notice there's been a lot of activities when it comes to sprite work for the last few weeks or so. Actually, for the last few months since I set up this Patreon page, I've been heavily having them worked on because now I have more funding, so things can be worked on a lot quicker and in much larger numbers. At better quality standards, I might add. So, at this point, I've got about 95 Sprite Sheets set up. Looking at the regular enemy list right now to my right, I think there was a grand total of about 130 enemies. That's not counting the bosses, of course. But the enemies are the hardest part of it, because there were just so many of them, so many different color palettes, so many different special effects, etc. So that's a big chunk of work done. A lot of the sprites I wanted done are finished. There's still quite a number more I want to have done before I move on to bosses. But at the moment, I have artists who are working hard and tirelessly on this. And those of you who have looked at my page have noticed this. I've put up multiple Sprite Sheets before, so you guys can see some of the stuff that's been going around. However, let's talk about Sprite Sheets in general. Now, Sprite Sheets for the game, in the original version of the game, they're all what I call cut up into little pieces. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, simply go to spritersresource.com and type in Symphony of the Night and look at the way the sheets look for the enemies. They're in tons of itty bitty little tiny pieces. Now, the reason Sprite Sheets were done like this is due to RAM and VRAM limitations. Basically, there were limitations in limitations with processing power, limitations with VRAM, limitations of what could be loaded into memory, etc. So, in the case of the PlayStation, they had to get extremely creative, and they did a hell of a job. This is part of the reason why if you hack the game and try to load an enemy into a room that's from a different room in the area, a lot of times it'll appear scrambled because its graphics were not set to be loaded into VRAM. So you just get scrambled graphics, but the AI works. Now, mind you, if you try to load an enemy from one stage, let's say the Coliseum, into an area where it doesn't appear in like the Marble Gallery, it won't work. It just won't work. Their AI isn't there. There are even some areas where you can test this, like I believe in Akmoden's room, I managed to get the graphics for the bone musket to load by accident. I don't know how I did it, but I accidentally got the bone musket graphics to load in his room, and of course the bone musket did nothing. It just sat there. It had no AI, you know, the system didn't know what to point to. It was just graphics. So it really depends on what's in each individual file, but that was a major limitation in the original game. Now, there are ways to hack it so you can load more of those enemies into RAM as long as they appear in that particular stage. Each stage, every time you go into a load room, it's loading another file from the ISO. Okay, so each stage had its own little bin file. If the enemy was in that bin file, well, great, you could use it in that stage. If it wasn't in that bin file, well, there was no way to load it in. That's all there is to it. Their AI just wasn't there. Even if the graphics were somehow there, and they 99% of the time weren't, it was useless to you. But again, those are all limitations because of file size, technology. I don't have any of those issues. So what does that mean? That means I don't really have to cut up the enemies into separate little images. I don't really so much have to worry about the sprite sheet size. I can make sprite sheets any size I want. Now, of course, there are ways to do this that are more intelligent than others that'll make the game run better. So that's the way I'm trying to do it. I'm trying to set it up so that instead of having separate sheets for each animation, like I do for the player, and I do this for the player because you're only going to have one of the player on screen at a time. Maybe two at extreme most in a doppelganger fight. But enemies, you could have the same enemy on screen 10, 15 times. So instead of having different animations on different sheets, each enemy has one sheet. And all of its animations are on that one sheet, and they're all concise together in a way that it doesn't waste space on the sheet, but the sheet isn't that gigantic in size. Even if I do cut something down in size, it's cut down in a way that, hey, it's quick to simply import it in the game, cut up the sheet, and set up the animations, because I don't want to spend, let's say, something like a Skelerang. I don't want to spend hours setting up one single animation dealing with 6, 7 separate pieces. That's just stupid. It just doesn't make any sense. It's a waste of time. It's not worth the amount of VRAM or resources that it's going to save. It's just a total waste and just giving myself a headache and more work and a delay how soon the project comes out. And that's a big thing. How effective is something? What's the benefit of doing it versus how much time it takes? And as the project director, that's something I always have to consider. Let's first start off by looking at a sprite sheet for one of the smaller enemies here. I'm going to go ahead and point out what I mean, because it'll be easier if you guys have a bit of a visual aid here. Alright, first, since I mentioned Skelerang, I'm going to use him. Now, here is all 42 of Skelerang's sprites. You can ignore these over here. These are ones I had made for him being knocked up in the air, but these are his 42 original sprites. Now, in the case of smaller enemies, I generally don't cut them up. It's stupid and redundant, but in the case of this guy, you can see a lot of these sprites are very, very similar to one another, and you can see how long this image is. I mean, this is ridiculous. To create a sheet like this would just be oversized for no particular reason, versus here is his completed sheet cut up. And you'll notice most of the sprites are still assembled. We even have new sprites in here for when he's popped up, for when he's sent flying away from you. And you can see the cut up is very minimal, okay? Most of them are in one piece, and if not, they're very easily assembled. Okay, so what I can do here is this sheet, let me show you the size of it. It's 256 by 262 pixels. That's itty bitty. And that's what most of it assembled here. Okay, now I don't know what that artifact is there, excuse me. Let's get this out of the way. Okay, now let's look at this one. $2436 by 69. Yeah, that's just obscene, and that's way too large. Just too large. It doesn't need to be that big versus just this. And this is something that's going to be very simple for me to assemble, because I look at the other fully assembled one as I'm going through this, and I simply put it together, and that's it. I have individual sprites set up, and there are a number of ways I can do this in Unity. I'm not going to go into too many technical details because I don't want to get too technical in this video. I don't want you guys to start snoring and falling asleep over there thinking, oh my god, he's going on and on and on. Anyway, you guys got the idea. It's boring as hell. I want to make these videos at least halfway entertaining while I'm updating you guys. So let's take a look at the skeleton, for example. You'll notice he's fully assembled here. These sprites you see over here where it looks kind of funny, you have the legs, the arms, the skeleton, the skull, that's actually how these pieces you see over here are assembled when he is killed. Okay? That's all that is a template, and all of the skeletons are assembled the same way. So it's just a template for me. But you can see how little the sheet is, even with the new knockback and spinning animations I put in. You can see how tiny it is. This is 202 by 184 pixels. That's not going to use up any RAM, it's not going to use up a lot of disk space, etc. And it's a simple thing to set up. This is also perfect the way it is. Ideally, I want them fully assembled because that's the quickest way to do it. I simply drag each of these in for each animation, position it, done deal. Okay, that makes life a lot quicker and a lot easier overall. Now, speaking of sprites, let's talk a little bit about what exactly is involved in getting these sprites. I will tell you guys up front, if you look on Spriter's resource, you'll see how the sprite sheets are all cut up. I can't use those because, one, in pieces they don't really do me any good, and two, the majority of them have pixels missing, incorrect colors, all kinds of problems that I just don't want to sift through. So I'm better off re-ripping them myself, especially because they'll be fully assembled. The time it takes to re-rip them myself fully assembled is much lower than the time it would take to figure out the errors with them, recolor them, make edits, and then put them together off of Spriter's resource. I'm not saying anything bad about Spriter's resource. I think it's an amazing site, but just for my purposes, it's not going to work here. What is working for me though is this amazing DSVania editor created by Lago Lunatic on romhacking.net. You know, you all go check him out over there. You know, it's very easy to find this. It's an excellent tool. The guy's a genius. You know, if he takes donations, feel free to donate to him. I'm sure he won't complain about that. Quick shout out to him though, because this is an excellent tool. It's made my life a lot easier. And here's why. In the DSVanias, we have a number of enemies from Symphony of the Night. And as you can see on your screen here, I've gone to one particular enemy, the Owl Knight. Just clicked on him, and here you can see the different animations. You can simply click on different ones to see them. You can see the individual frames, and you can even see the delay, the timing here. So this is an excellent tool to help set up animations without me having to go into Symphony of the Night and write things down frame by frame. Which, truth be told, I'm still going to have to make a guide for the enemies, which I'm about to show you guys shortly to make life a little easier, but this takes a lot of the work out of it. Okay, and you can see the animation here for Owl Knight and his owl. You can see the sheet over here. You can see there's options for opening in the graphics editor, which is what I had up initially. And right here, this sheet cut up like this, I can't so much use this like this because again, it's not assembled. But still, for my purposes, it does make life a bit quicker. The palette over here is somewhat useful, but I can actually rip those directly from each individual stage file pretty fast, so not so much useful for this, but as a reference, this is definitely helpful if I'm looking at animations and trying to figure out a quick way to cut them up without going overboard. And a couple of times for a couple of things like the marionette enemy, for example, it was useful at extracting all the pieces and the different palettes out. Overall, just a useful side tool to have. If an enemy's not in here, all I do is go into memhack, go to the particular stage I want in my EPSXE emulator, and just use some of the codes that I know of in memhack to black out the background. And that's it. Then it's a simple matter of finding the enemy I want, freezing him in place by going into RAM and altering the correct timings, remove any rotation, scaling, transparency, additive blending, etc. so that I just have the default sprite showing in front of me, and that's handy for things like effects. And then I know which is the value in RAM for each individual graphic frame. So I just change that one by one while the game is paused, and use a little snipping tool to cut it out. Simply erase the black background, and voila, another sprite is done. And that's very useful for getting some of those hard to get effects that you just don't see on Spriter's resource or even displayed in this tool. It's just to go into the game and do that. I even found a way to hack 3D objects in a way that I can get them to show me their texture. And then it's a simple matter of just copying that texture. I was passing it on to a 3D artist when I was doing 3D objects. They're all done now. And then they know how to texture an object, and that just makes life much, much easier. So, I'm doing a lot of talking about Owl Knight here. Why don't we take a look at his sprite sheet and you guys can see the results versus what we have here that's all cut up and would just be, ugh, like sifting through this would not be fun. This would be a nightmare to put this together considering how many frames he has. So let's take a look at that. And voila, here he is. If he looks a little pixelated and distorted, it's because I'm zoomed out here and I'm using Windows Photo Viewer. Now, this sheet is only 242 by 470 pixels. And that's because I cut out the head of the sword you can see in several frames. This in itself saved a lot of space. Before I did that, the sheet was something like 768 by 600 pixels, I think. So it saved a significant amount of space just cutting this blade out of several images. And then it's a simple matter of just copying and pasting it over the frames again. As you can see here, it's pretty easy to figure out where that blade goes. You know, it's pretty obvious what each frame is. So this isn't something that's going to take a lot of time. And even something like this here where the bottom part was all the same, I just cut out the top frames, and now it's a simple matter of, okay, paste the top onto the bottom for each animation as needed, and we're good to go. I could have cut it up more, but again, the idea is to make it so that when I'm doing animations, this is very quick, simple, and painless. Now, mind you, this is just his current animations. If I zoom in a little bit, you'll notice we have a color palette in the lower left corner here. For enemies that use 16 colors or less, I have a color palette shader that simply reads the R value. And then it's a simple matter of arranging these in order. I have to arrange them from lowest to highest, and then when I import it into the engine, I just have to put it, let's say it's color number 1, where it'll go in space number, well, 0 would be the first space, but that's all transparency. So color number 1 would go in space, with R value 1 would go in space 2. If it had a value of, let's say, 10, 11, 27, well, that one would go in space 11, and so on and so forth, and that's how you set the palettes up. It sounds like a big deal, but it's really not. The other thing is, in the original Symphony of the Night game, they set up the cycling a specific way. The cycling is designed to go in shades, which is what gives it that nice effect, versus the cycling being chaotic and it just blinks all over the place and it looks like a misshapen mess. You'll notice the enemies always have the same shape and you can always tell what's what. Like if I apply cycling to this guy in the original Symphony of the Night, you can tell where his legs are, you can tell the design on the loincloth, you can tell the design on this little piece of fluff on his helmet. You can tell what's what because they do it in a specific fashion. And I'm trying to duplicate that here so that when I do color cycling, it doesn't look all chaotic and make the sprite look messed up, which is a big part of it. So again, this is thinking in advance. This is stuff that just needs to be taken into account if I want this project to succeed. Now here, we have a much more involved enemy. I'm not sure why this folder's used, so I'm just going to yank it out while you guys watch. Okay. The Armor Lord. Now, here's his assembled sheet, and mind you, the assembled sheet doesn't have all of his frames on it, okay? And it's 506 by 605. Now, that's not really a big deal. It's not a huge deal, but keep in mind, again, all of his sprites are not here, you know, so now let's look at this one. 480 by 262, which is quite a bit smaller. But let's look at the sheet itself. As you can see, same trick. I simply cut the blade out of several frames, and they're much smaller than they would be. If I had put these blades into these frames, oh my god, they would need a huge amount of space for each one, and it'd just be a huge mess. Versus the way it is now is a simple, okay, copy, paste, you know, put a blade over this spot, put a blade over that spot, and it's done. Each frame of animation is done, and I can actually preset these up in a way that is simply, okay, well, once I've preset the blade in position, let's say for all of these sprites, now I just go into that individual animation sheet and copy and paste the frames I need into each animation, and we're good to go. So it's a much quicker process. I have things stored up. It's much more efficient like that. Now you'll also notice for this guy, we have the palette for the Guardian version of him. Keep in mind, when I'm talking about enemies here, different palette swapped enemies count as one enemy. So this Armor Lord, even though he'll have a gold upgraded version of him, that counts as one enemy. If I'm talking about sheets, like let's say the last time I updated, I think I said I had about 71 sheets done. Even being sick, even working as much as I have, I'm now up to 94 of them. So that's most of the enemies. I think the enemy count, well, last I checked for what I was going to include, was 130. Bosses, of course, are separate, but bosses aren't that much of a big deal. You know, bosses aren't something that I need right now. Versus enemies that can be used all over the place, bosses are like, well, I can take my sweet time, because the ones that are going to appear later in the game obviously don't need to be done at this moment. So, but I digress. You'll see the palette in the lower left here, and this is actually not arranged in RGB order like I was just talking about for the previous sprites with 16 colors or less, or maybe a little more than 16, 20, 24 even, I'll do that. But for the ones like these that have this many colors, that's going to be obnoxious trying to get independent R values or unique R values for each color, and it's just going to be a pain to put them in order and then do the cycling after. I'm just going to use a different type of shader that'll actually read the R, G, and B values instead of just the R values. So why am I wasting my time on this? Well, those of you who are technology oriented will know if I use RGB instead of R, that's, well, there's 3 times as many calculations for each pixel. When you're working with graphics, that can add up quickly. Now for even an enemy like this, you know, if I was to use this shader for maybe 20, 30 of them, it wouldn't really affect anything, you know, so it's kind of being a little redundant, but I'm thinking in advance. You never know what's going to happen later on, and I want to make sure it runs efficiently on everybody's system. But the point is, what you guys want to take away from this is that I have a shader set up so it makes doing this a lot quicker and more efficient, and make sure I can do all the color tricks on it, while at the same time not wasting time having to sift through this mess. I mean, could you imagine sifting through this? I mean, oh my god, you know, that would not be fun, all these colors here. You know, meanwhile, smaller enemies are done more efficiently. You know, and also this is done in a way so that the sheets will stay full color. I don't have to make them one solid spectrum of red or green or blue, which is the trick a lot of people use when they create palette shaders. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit here. I'm going into a little bit of what I call the nerd details, but hey, whatever. You know, I know there's people out there that are interested in this, so I like to discuss them. The slashes, as you can see, they have their own palette. You know, these don't use color cycling, so I mean, this is just for reference here because I can use this palette here, and then here's an alternate palette for the Guardian versions of them, and we're good to go. Armor Lord Shield, this is just literally color cycling. Like you can see there's 5 shades of gray here, it cycles through, and that's all that shield is. It's a single sprite that's scaled up. Pretty simple stuff. Here's what I call the palette sheet. This here, you can see the individual palettes, and these come from the original version of the game. You know, if you see all white here, that means it's transparent. It's just because I'm in Windows Photo Viewer, you know, it doesn't show up as transparent. But this way, when I do the color cycling later, I now know what order it goes in. So again, that we maintain all these details. A big part of this project is not to incur what I call loss of quality. I don't want you to look at this and think, oh, well, this is cool, but he lost a lot of the unique little graphics effects or neat little touches that made the original game just so amazing. If you lose those things that make the game amazing and creative and unique, well, then it's no longer the same game. It's become redundant. So that's a big part of what I do here. Just make sure we don't lose what I call the essence of what is Symphony of the Night. And here is the animation sheet I was referencing earlier in the video. Now you can see this one's for Owl Knight, and column B has the animation names. You can see we have each of the animation frame numbers rather, along with the particular sprite used. F equals 15, these are in hexadecimal. The timings, I converted over to decimal. And this is because in the DSVania editor, which is where I got the information for Owl Knight, the information is in hexadecimal format. So what I simply did was I took a master sheet that has all the sprites before I cut them up, and I simply put the frame numbers over them. So frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F, 10, 11, 12, etc. You know, so now I have that sheet, and okay, when I'm doing the animations, I can easily glance at it to see which one is which, and And then I have the timings here so I know how long to make them. Now, a lot of timings are obviously going to be altered. But the thing is, this is very useful for larger enemies where you could have several frames of animation that look very similar. And it can have a good number of animations. For a smaller enemy like a skeleton that just jumps around and throws bones and walks, I mean, I don't need something like this. No need to create it. But for a larger enemy with a lot more involved information, like the Owl Knight here, or maybe the Cthulhu spawn, Malachi, Armor Lord, etc., this is definitely a very handy tool to have, and I always like to take the time to create one. And with that, that's all I have to talk about in this update. I wanted this video to only be 10 minutes long, but again, I got all hyped and excited talking about the engine, so here we are at the 20+ minute mark. You know, I've set up a forum, and I've set up a Facebook group. You know, I have a number of help wanted positions up on the forum, as well as brainstorming threads. If you want to contribute ideas, there's a good place to do it. As always, subscribe to my Patreon page, and you can also make a one-time donation via PayPal. Links will be down below. Patreon supporters always get the priority, so jump on there if you want to get all your questions answered. You know, you want to see your ideas, have them acknowledged, get feedback on them, etc. I don't respond to YouTube comments. There's just too many of them, and well, we all know how the YouTube comment section generally is the equivalent of a roaring dumpster fire, replete with hobos huddled around it for warmth. So I tend to stay away from it. Nothing against my fans. You know, I know I got a lot of good ones out there, but you get lost in a sea of fucked up people, so it is what it is. Alright, and that's really all I have to say about that. You know, much like the lights in the project hallways, I'm out. I'll talk to y'all soon. Hope you enjoyed this update video. Leave a comment letting me know what you'd like to see next. Peace.